Today I will comment on a quite controversial topic. In fact, I think this topic turned out to be so controversial that even calling it controversial might already anger some people. This is a topic of the expulsion of the Arabic population from the territory of Israel during the Israeli War for Independence in 1948, which is also known as Nakba. That's how it was called by the Arabs, which means something like a disaster, because for them it was a really a dramatic event. The reason why I decided to do it because I recently came across an interesting exchange between two YouTubers on this topic, and I realized that I actually kind of disagree with both of them in the end. So I decided to comment on this. So one YouTuber is called Traveling Israel. He made several videos about this topic, and one of them was a response to some, I think, Vox article. Essentially in the defense of Israel viewpoint, pro-Zionists, pro-Zionist stand, so to say. And the person who replied to him, his name is LonerBox. He recorded a response, and after that, Traveling Israel recorded a response to his response, and then LonerBox responded again. So it was, you see, you could say 4 videos. So I think I'll cover it in the following way. At first, I will present the kind of Traveling Israel position, outlining his videos, and also I would say shortly in this little book by David Deutsch called The Short History of Israel. So yeah, and after that I will show you how exactly LonerBox replied to this, and comment why I think they was kind of wrong. So let's start, I guess, with travelingisrael position. Well, okay, so briefly, it's the story of the formation of Israel and the reason for its formation. Jews were kind of always historically persecuted. As you know, like in Europe, anti-Semitism was during medieval era was quite strong. Then it went down during the Enlightenment, and then it started to peak again with the rise of socialist ideas and altruistic ideas in the beginning of the 20th century. And during all those times, there were kind of division in Jewish intellectual community about whether what we should do. Should we try to assimilate in Europe, or should we try to form a new state? And if yes, then where? And that's how kind of the Zionist movement was born. They eventually decided to try it in in the Promised Land, and Jews started immigrating into it, and this immigration accelerated strongly during the rise of anti-Semitism at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the Arabs who were living there were upset with this turn of events. What's important here is that the Jews who were coming in, they were bringing in kind of Western culture. They were buying land from Arab owners, and then they were kind of spreading the ideas, right? They were, opening, Western like shops, cafes, kind of all the things people in Europe usually have. So they were very westernized in this sense. And Arabs had like more, well, maybe like traditionalist culture plus, they have different religion, right? So they were angry about it, and the tensions kind of start to rise. There were terrorist attacks by the Arabs against the Jews, and the British authority who were in charge of this the whole land after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right? They usually kind of favored Arabs in these conflicts. That angered the Jews, and they decided to start forming their own militias. The two most famous, I think, is called Haganah and Ingur or Ignor. I don't remember the name. So to defend themselves, basically. So Haganah was kind of moderate. um, um, and they were just kind of defending themselves. They were just trying to not initiate aggressions. And the second one, Igrun, I forgot. So they were kind of more violent, and they start committing their own terrorist attacks against Arabs and British authorities, because they realized, well, British side with the Arabs, there's no real justice, so we just start to invoke havoc on everybody. So yeah, so the conflict kind of escalated. Eventually, British decided to withdraw from this territory, give it to the United Nations, and United Nations made a decision to form new states under it in this territory, and they have to make a decision about the partition plan, whether there will be a Jewish state, the only Arab state, or what the territories should be. Originally, the British gave Jordan, the territory of Jordan, to Arabs, and Jews got the Israel, and this territory included actually Gaza and the West Bank. But Arabs didn't agree on this because they were fundamentally against the Israeli state. Well, from their perspective, well, Israel just came in and settled there, and now just because of that, they decided to take the Arabs territory and rule it. Yeah, so that's one of the secular concern, and another one, religious concern, that they religiously opposed to the creation of this Israeli state. I mean, at least some religious Arabs. So yeah, they said no to this, and then under the United Nations partition plan, they were given the West Bank and Gaza as well. I mean, well, approximately. I mean, there is a this map, United Nations partition plan. So they said no, anyways, to it as well. But the Jews agreed. The Jews agreed again. So after the British withdrew, Jews formed the state and Arabs didn't do it. Instead, there was a terrorist attack on the Jews, and then the Jews responded, and neighboring Arabic nation invaded Israel, the newly formed Israel. That's how the war started. So yeah, now during the war, now we finally got to the war. We could yes start discuss the most sensitive part, the topic of Nakba and what was happening with Arabs. So in this case, traveling to Israel, and I guess David Deutsch position that during all the military actions against this invading Arabic forces, a lot of Arabs were expelled from the land. Those Arabs who living in Israel, for like strategic reasons, just like to ease the like military action. Plus, yeah, Jews were afraid that they're kind of sympathetic to this invading Arabic forces, and it might lead to problems and so on. Also, Arabs themselves, a lot of times they flee because they were afraid. In some cases, at least the case which they described in the video in details in Haifa, Arab leaders flee themselves and then told Arabs to flee as well, while some Jews in the city was actually asking them to stay. But Arabs fled anyway, and something like this. So there were a mixture of these kind of events, just kind of actual attacks, fear of attack or fear of uncertainty. So that's kind of the traveling Israel position. Yeah, and there were, of course, he admit there was some kind of massacres like Der Yassin, but that's mostly happened because of kind of chaos of war and partial and also disorganization of Israeli forces, because the Israeli forces were essentially formed from this Irgun and Haganah, two different militias which actually opposed each other and thought about each other as traitors. Irgun thought about Haganah as some sort of too soft. Haganah thought about Irgun as like too violent, and Irgun was eager to take more radical actions. They were looking for some target. They choose Der Yassin. Again, Israeli leaders were opposed to it, but they were afraid that Irgun will do something bad, like to do something anyway. They will lose control of the army, and it's even worse during the war. So eventually, Irgun went out to this village and basically killed a bunch of Arabs. I think that like who were even trying to make like a peace act with the Jews in this case. Yeah, so that's how traveling to Israel side presents their points. Yeah, and he actually, there is actually, I would say that's his view on Nakba. There is also a separate video he recorded on like the status of West Bank and Gaza today. So he said that because Arabs just always rejected the partition plans and Jews agreed to them, we should apply the same principle to Israel as to any nation which was formed under the collapse of some empire which has autonomous territories within it. So the new nation just had the border of the territory prior to it. So by this idea, Gaza and West Bank just belong to Israel. So yeah, so that's his points. So he's kind of, I would say, pro-Israeli Canonized position. So now I'll show you how LonerBox replied to this. In his video. Yeah.
Is the best example of what really happened to the Arabs in the war and how they came to be refugees.
Now, I have to wonder, why does Traveling Israel think this is the best example of what happened in 1948?
Yeah, they're talking about Haifa, which I tried to, the story which I tried to retell you, that where Arab leadership fled and told Arabs to flee as well, and the Jewish mayor told them to stay, but then the Israeli forces came in and well, there was a lot of fighting, psychological warfare, and anyway, Arabs were scared and left anyway. But now LonerBox present the counter argument to the position that that's what mostly happened.
Does he think this was the norm? Was it often the case that Palestinians were asked to stay by the Jews and only left because their own leaders told them to? Well, thankfully, we have an entire list of all the communities that were depopulated during the war and their decisive cause of abandonment. So here we have A for abandonment on Arab orders. You can go down to Haifa, where there's an A and also an M for military assault on settlements, so that all makes sense. We have a good number of E's there, which means the people were directly expelled by Jewish forces. But don't worry about those ones. So if Haifa really is the best example, how many A's do we have here? Well, out of 377 towns and villages, we have 6.
So yeah, and he basically says that well, majority of expulsion happened like forcefully. Well, I would say it still doesn't really mean anything by itself yet because, well, yeah, it's a war and there's chaos and I don't know how much of expulsion could have happened for strategic reasons and so on. I don't know how to estimate it. Yeah, but here makes some further arguments.
6 cases where...
Okay.
Box want to show you that the Jews planned the transfer of the Arabs. The thing is that in all Zionist documents, from the first Zionist Congress to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, there is absolutely nothing to support this theory. They actually state the opposite, that all people will enjoy equal rights. The Zionist movement never said anything about removing non-Jews from the land. On the contrary, the Zionist movement said very clearly that all people from all religions could be granted their human rights.
This, I think, is Traveling Israel at his worst. He is either lying or just horribly ignorant. We have countless examples of people in the Zionist movement speaking favorably about the notion of removing non-Jews. Some of them even saw what they called transfer as something that was necessary for establishing the Jewish state. By the way, for the purpose of this section, the word transfer is just a euphemism for expulsion. In this context, they mean exactly the same thing. For one example, even Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, may have publicly had a very utopian vision of cooperation between Jews and Arabs, but privately his feelings were a little different. In 1895, he wrote in his diary about a much more sobering expectation of what would happen, arguing, "We must expropriate gently. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." Right at the turn of the century, he was warned by a Jerusalem dignitary that Zionism could only succeed against the will of the Arab majority, that dispossession and war would be the inevitable outcome. Herzl, who seemed to hold similar feelings in private, simply dismissed the warnings. As for Zionist leadership leading up to 1948, well, when Traveling Israel says, from the first Zionist Congress to the Declaration of Independence, he's really just digging his own hole there. At the 20th Zionist Congress in 1937, a certain leader argued, in many parts of the country, new Jewish settlement will not be possible unless there is a transfer of the Arab peasantry. The transfer of the population is what makes possible a comprehensive settlement plan. Jewish power in the country, which is continuously growing, will also increase our possibilities to carry out the transfer on a large scale. You must remember that this method contains an important humane and Zionist idea: to shift parts of a people, i.e. Palestine Arabs, to their own country and to settle empty lands. The leader who said that was David Ben-Gurion, who would go on to become Israel's first prime minister in 1948. It's actually kind of ironic that Traveling Israel came out with such a strong statement as the Zionist movement never said anything about removing non-Jews from the land. Not only is it completely false, but you could actually make an equally strong statement in the other direction. I could say that throughout the 30s and 40s, Ben-Gurion never went on record against the idea of transfer. Actually, he spoke in support of it quite often. In 1938, he told the Jewish Agency executive that he supported compulsory transfer and that he didn't see in it anything immoral. In 1944, he argued that the transfer of Arabs is easier than any other transfer. There are Arab states around Palestine, and it is clear that if the Arabs are dispatched out of Palestine, this will ameliorate their situation, not the contrary. As for other leaders, Chaim Weizmann, the liberal leader who would later become Israel's first president, spoke about the notion of transferring 500,000 Arabs and 2 million Jews being put in their place. In his words, that would be a first installment, and he even suggested where the first removals would take place. And it also seems to be the case that supportive statements like this can be found from the majority of Zionist leaders in the decades leading up to the war. So, I don't know why Traveling Israel believes no one ever said these kinds of things. He hasn't said why, but anyway.
Yeah, and also he mentions what happened after the war. You find where it was.
Conditional, but that's not really the point. What I think the Nakba shows is that you don't necessarily need a piece of paper saying execute Order 66 to kick out all the Arabs in order to achieve that result. Even if you believe that Plan Dalet wasn't, quote, an expulsion policy, that doesn't mean expulsion still wasn't a desired outcome. And often when people latch on to the idea that there was no expulsion policy, they don't really seem to understand the full context of that argument. That when someone does make that point, they might make it like this. Ben-Gurion clearly wanted as few Arabs as possible in the Jewish state. From early on, he hoped that they would flee. He hinted at this in February 1948, and he said so explicitly in meetings in August, September, and October. But no expulsion policy was ever enunciated, and Ben-Gurion always refrained from issuing clear or written expulsion orders. He preferred that his generals understand what he wanted. He probably wished to avoid going down in history as the great expeller, and he did not want his government to be blamed for a morally questionable policy. And personally, I don't think this sounds like someone who isn't supporting the idea of expulsion. This looks like someone who is endorsing expulsion, encouraging it, whilst repeatedly washing his hands of it. As for the Palestinians, sure, most of them were not directly ordered to leave their homes at the point of a gun. Does that mean they weren't still forced out? If news of massacres and indiscriminate assaults are sweeping across the area, and someone leaves their village knowing that the groups who carried out those atrocities are approaching, is that person really leaving of their own accord? Well, no, obviously not. That's insane. People can debate the nuances of whether or not Plan Dalet was an expulsion policy. That's fine. But if people like Traveling Israel want to claim that expulsion wasn't at least one of Israel's goals, how does he explain what happened after the war? Because after the war, the majority of the depopulated villages were destroyed, and most of this destruction took place directly at the hands of the Zionist forces after the fighting had ended. Some of the sites, including Deir Yassin, had new settlements built directly over them. Others became parks, recreational spaces, or military sites. Others were left in ruins. The result, as it was well understood by the leaders, was that it killed off any prospect of the Arab refugees ever returning. For the few who did make it back across the border, they found that there was nothing to return to. Most of them were stopped at the border and turned away. Other times, they were shot at. And these measures were taken directly in line with IDF policy of preventing a refugee return. So, how do we wrap this up?
Okay, so that's his response. Now, what I think happened here. So I don't know. Of course, first of all, I didn't check all of his sources, and I can't do it, right? So I would say his main point is that yeah, Ben Gurion and the Israeli leaders they didn't want to explicitly mention that they want to kick out Arabs from the land, but they kind of wished this to happen, and they knew that if this would be kind of understood by the generals, they could always blame, you know, the war and chaos for this forceful expulsion later, which they did. So, yeah, why I think that LonerBox is probably right here is because I see the fundamental problem which the Jews were not able to solve because they didn't have the right philosophical or moral views to do it. So essentially, the problem for the Jews was that the leaders were mostly democratic socialists at this time, and they wanted to build some sort of social democracy in Israel, which means, well, everybody has equal voting rights and potentially, I don't know, welfare and all this thing. And this kind of would be hard to do when you have almost the majority or approximately half of the population being Arabs who don't support your Western culture and Western values at all, or at least partially, who are in favor of some Sharia law. Like, what does it mean to have a democracy if, say, surrounded by people who would like to use force against you? It's like instead of, you know, defending yourself with a gun, you're saying something like, oh, okay, let's just vote, and well, whoever get the majority of votes will decide what will happen to my property when they're trying to loot you. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. So yeah, the constitutional republic would partially hold it back, requiring some sort of overmajority to change the constitution, but all the people inside the checks and balances system would still be elected from the majority, and if the Arabs would be like well represented there, fairly represented there, the law would just not be enforced properly. So Ben Gurion as leaders, they kind of understood that yeah, if you have lots of Arabs in your country and give them voting rights, they will vote like collectivistically, tribalistically. They will be just in gigantic pressure group, favoring some sort of backwards views. And in fact, as similarly to many countries which tried socialism at some point, they realized that, well, okay, socialism fails, but the globalist socialism fails, but the solution is, oh, we need to do national socialism. We have to expel all this kind of non-ethnically clean people who don't share our culture, and they'll be just fine. So this, and actually Traveling Israel admits that this is a standard picture with the formation of nationalistic state. People getting expelled. That Israel is not unique. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because they have wrong views on the state and its role. And therefore they have wrong views on the voting rights. I think the correct solution is there should not be a universal voting right. The principle of one person vote should be abandoned. Because if you think about the government as just a rights protecting organization, then we know what kind of internal structure emerge naturally on the market within any company. It's usually you purchase shares, and then people might have voting rights proportional to the shares they purchased. This means rich people have higher portion of a vote. They have higher voting rights. So it makes the voting system kind of merit based if you have free market. So in free market, smarter people, more educated people tend to be richer. And that would effectively cut out all the bad decision making which Arabs could be part of. And by the way, if you think I'm just only against Arabs in this case, in this conflict, that would also help Israel today with this rise of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are really unproductive, who have really, really awful, terrible religious backward culture, and they just breed, multiply, and spread, and they take over the country by just numbers. So, but they're very poor because they don't work, they just read Torah all day. So they would have way less voting rights in the system. Yes, and the whole reason why the reason why Israel didn't discover the right solutions because they were way into this leftist, modern leftist ideas, which kind of worship democracy as equivalent to freedoms. But it wasn't always the case. I mean, in fact, if you look at Greek democracies, I think most major philosophers, at least Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, they were all opposed to democracies, and they had even good reason from their own experience to why, right? These democracies were constantly taking really bad decisions, like very emotional, impulsive, where there was no actual accountability for errors, and the results were frequently disastrous. And as you know, for Socrates, it literally cost him his life. And it's also interesting that I found that even in US in the beginning, there was no universal voting rights even for white men. As its founding, the experiment of American democracy held the promise of self-government. At the time, this meant that only about 6% of the population could vote, reflecting general acceptance of the notion that not all citizens had the right to vote. At this time, only those who had a vested interest in the country, that is, those who owned property, warranted such a right. You see? So they kind of thought about it like, if you own property, it's like you own stake in this company. Yeah, and then as you can see, they gradually abandoned it. expand the voting rights to everyone. And I don't know, it's not clear whether it was good. US got less free gradually over time, except for, with the exception to slavery. Yeah, of course, you could argue, well, is the system kind of also bad? Will it consolidate power of the hands of the rich? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are maybe other alternatives. For example, yeah, Aristotle proposed a system where the voting rights depends on your virtues. But he had this notion of virtues, right? Which every person need to strive for, to be virtuous. And it has some very special notion, special definition, but it's very hard to test. I don't know what kind of tests you would like to have to make sure that person like adheres to proper ideas. That seems like the state will be captured by some sort of technocrats in this case. And wealth is just kind of unbiased metric. So yeah, I don't know. That's my idea. I mean, it's not mine. I guess it existed before. You could say it's some form of anarcho-capitalism. But I don't know. I feel like that's what Jews should have done, and then they wouldn't have to expel anybody. And the reason why they have to expel is because that was second best option. You either, well, just lay down and die, right? Not leave, or you well, defend yourself. In some sense, yeah, that goes back to the question of what is a state, right? State is just an, well, and whether there is a question whether Israel has a right to exist, right? Or well, the state itself doesn't have a right, but you have a right to self-defense, and you could form organizations which are necessary to defend your life more effectively. In some sense, you could say that when Haganah and Irgun were formed, that was already a Jewish, state or protest state. It was just not recognized by United Nations or other states, but it still was kind of serving its standard state function, which is the protection of the rights of the people. So why I disagree with the LonerBox? Because he has this wrong leftist view on the function of the state and the question of land ownership. Let me show you. Here's what he says.
Sorry, I know people are going to have a go at me if I don't give the context for this, so here's a quick speed run. In 1947, the population in Palestine was about 1/3 Jewish and 2/3 Arab, and both groups wanted a state. The British, who had been in charge of Palestine for 30 years, gave up on trying to resolve this issue and handed it over to the UN. The UN proposed to cut up the territory into this funny old thing consisting of an Arab state, a Jewish state, and Jerusalem as an international zone. The Zionists said, well, half our state is a desert, and with these borders, the population will still be 45% Arab, but, we're going to bring in a bunch of Jewish immigrants, it'll be fine, and they accepted the plan. The Arabs said, mate, you can't just barge into someone's living room, sit there for 30 years, and then offer to split the house 50-50 and call it a fair deal. The Arabs, who made up 90% of the population in 1917, had no say in there being a Jewish state here, nor did they even have any say in the borders. You see,
So, yeah, as you can see, you have this kind of idea that, well, the state is this kind of sacred entity which kind of enforces the idea that the land belonged to the people. So it's not like he was thinking that the process of formation of its state itself is the process of stealing land. But it's not the case, because the state should not own land. States only provide protection for people. That this concept is kind of made up. The land which were owned by the Jews, they were purchased legitimately. It wasn't stolen. So there's no problem with the formation of the Jewish state if it would be formed in the proper sense. But of course, Arabs oppose it as well for their religious reasons, which means they thought about the state as this sacred entity which enforces the idea that the land belongs to the people as a community, which again, surprisingly, exactly the same idea which the leftist people held. So yeah, that's why I think that LonerBox is wrong, because that's not what happened there. Yes, you could purchase land as an individual, freely associate with other people. You could live there. You could, build cafes, shops, factories, what you want, and you could defend your rights. You could form Haganah if you are attacked. What you don't have is what's called, people call it, right to your culture, which would Arabs wanted. They didn't like it. They didn't like what's happening, how world around them changes, and they initiated force, trying to enforce their culture. That's was wrong. So yeah, that's what happened in my opinion. So in a summary, Jews were kind of wrong in the way they solved the problem, but the problem was still the Arabs' ideology. Arabs were the problem. So again, thanks for your attention. See you next time.